The sound of breaking glass echoed through the valley as another rock crashed through the window of the small wooden house. Li Wei pressed her back against the wall, her heart pounding as angry voices grew louder outside. Her 7-year-old daughter huddled behind her, tears streaming down her face. "We know you're in there. Chinese woman," a man's voice boomed. "This is our land now." Li Wei had come to America in 1882 with dreams of building a new life, but the California gold rush had brought more than fortune seekers. It had brought hatred, violence, and men who believed that anyone who looked different didn't belong. As the mob outside grew more aggressive, she whispered a prayer to her ancestors and held her daughter closer. She had no idea that watching from the tree line above, a weathered mountain man named Samuel Morrison was loading his rifle and making a decision that would change all their lives forever. This is the true story of an unlikely friendship forged in the fire of prejudice, where one man's conscience would stand against an entire town's rage, and where a mother's desperate fight for survival would reveal the true meaning of courage in the American frontier. Li Wei clutched the worn letter in her trembling hands as the ship rocked violently in the Pacific storm. The ink had smeared from her tears and the salt spray, but she could still make out her husband's careful handwriting promising a better life in Gold Mountain, as the Chinese called America. Chen had left their village in Guangdong province 3 years earlier, joining thousands of Chinese men seeking fortune in California's gold fields. His last letter had been full of hope and contained enough money for passage to San Francisco. The journey across the ocean had been a nightmare. Crammed into the ship's lower deck with dozens of other Chinese immigrants, Li Wei and her daughter May had endured weeks of seasickness, contaminated water, and the constant fear of the violent storms that seemed to chase their vessel across the endless blue. Many passengers had died during the crossing, their bodies wrapped in canvas and committed to the sea with brief prayers. Li Wei had held May close during those dark moments, whispering stories of the beautiful life waiting for them in America. When the ship finally docked in San Francisco in the spring of 1882, Li Wei's heart sank. The city was nothing like Chen's letters had described. Smoke billowed from countless factories, and the harbor reeked of fish and human waste. Chinese immigrants were herded like cattle into a separate processing area, where white officials shouted at them in English and stamped documents with aggressive force. Many families were separated, with children crying for parents who had been detained for additional questioning. Li Wei clutched the address Chen had sent her, written in both Chinese characters and English letters. The boarding house in Chinatown was supposed to be their temporary home until Chen returned from the gold fields. But when she finally reached the narrow alley where the building stood, the landlord, an elderly Chinese man named Mr. Wu, delivered devastating news. Chen had been killed 6 months earlier in a mining accident. The mine owners had refused to send his body home or pay compensation to his family. The grief hit Li Wei like a physical blow. She collapsed to her knees in the muddy street, May crying beside her. Everything they had sacrificed, the dangerous journey, the money spent on passage, the dreams of a new life, all seemed meaningless now. Mr. Wu helped them to their feet and explained the harsh reality of Chinese life in America. The Chinese Exclusion Act had just been passed, making it nearly impossible for Chinese people to become citizens or bring their families to America. Violence against Chinese immigrants was common, and most Americans viewed them as temporary workers who should eventually return to China. But Li Wei had no money to return home and no home to return to. The drought that had driven them from their village had continued, and letters from relatives spoke of famine and death. She was trapped between two worlds, neither of which wanted her. Mr. Wu offered her work in his boarding house, cleaning rooms and cooking for the other immigrants, but the wages were barely enough to feed herself and May. For months, Li Wei worked from dawn to midnight, scrubbing floors, washing clothes, and serving meals to the endless stream of Chinese men who passed through the boarding house. Most were miners, railroad workers, or laborers heading to various work sites throughout California. They shared stories of the wealth to be found in the mountains, of gold nuggets the size of eggs, and of Chinese miners who had struck it rich and returned to China as wealthy men. But they also spoke of the violence of entire Chinese camps being burned by angry white settlers, of men disappearing in the night, never to be seen again. Despite the warnings, Li Wei began to formulate a plan. She had learned enough English from listening to Mr. Wu's conversations with American suppliers to understand basic transactions. More importantly, she had discovered that Chun had filed a claim on a small piece of land near a mining camp called Pine Ridge, high in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The claim was legally hers as his widow, though she suspected that American law might not recognize her rights. But it was her only chance at independence and a future for May. She began saving every penny, eating only rice and vegetables while ensuring May had enough food to grow strong. She studied maps of California that miners had left behind, tracing the route to Pine Ridge with her finger and memorizing the landmarks. Other Chinese immigrants thought she was crazy. A woman traveling alone to the gold fields was unthinkable, and a Chinese woman would face dangers that even Chinese men struggled to survive. But Li Wei had made her decision. On a cold morning in November 1882, she packed their few belongings into a canvas bag, sewed their savings into the lining of her coat, and purchased passage on a supply wagon heading into the mountains. The wagon driver, a rough American man named Jake Murphy, had initially refused to take them. Only when Li Wei offered to pay double the normal fare did he reluctantly agree, warning her that he wouldn't be responsible for their safety once they reached Pine Ridge. The journey into the mountains took 3 days through increasingly treacherous terrain. The wagon bounced and lurched over rocky paths, and the November cold cut through their thin clothing like knives. May developed a fever on the second day, and Li Wei used precious water to cool her daughter's burning forehead while silently praying to her ancestors for protection. Murphy stopped only when necessary, grumbling about the delay and making it clear that he regretted taking them along. When they finally reached Pine Ridge, Li Wei's heart sank again. The mining camp was little more than a collection of ramshackle tents and crude wooden buildings scattered along a muddy creek. About 200 miners lived there, almost all of them white Americans who stared at Li Wei and May with undisguised hostility. Murphy dumped their belongings in the mud and collected his payment before driving away as quickly as possible, leaving them standing alone in the center of the camp. The first person to approach them was a massive man with a black beard and clothes that reeked of alcohol and unwashed sweat. He introduced himself as Bill Hawkins, the unofficial leader of the mining camp, and demanded to know what business a Chinese woman had in their territory. When Li Wei showed him Chen's claim papers, written in both Chinese and English, Hawkins laughed and tore the documents to pieces. He told her that no Chinese had any right to own land in America, and that she and her daughter needed to leave immediately or face the consequences. Li Wei's English was not good enough to argue legal points, and she realized that appealing to American law would be useless in this remote place. Instead, she offered to work for food and shelter, promising to cook, clean, and wash clothes for anyone willing to hire her. Hawkins sneered and suggested that there were other services a Chinese woman could provide, his meaning clear from his leering expression and the laughter of the men around him. That night, Li Wei and May huddled together in a makeshift shelter she had built from canvas and tree branches near the edge of the camp. The temperature dropped below freezing, and she could hear men discussing what to do about the Chinese woman and child. Some voices were merely annoyed, wanting them gone as quickly as possible. But others spoke of violence, of teaching all Chinese people a lesson about where they belonged. Li Wei held May close and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake bringing her daughter to this hostile place. The next morning brought their first real taste of the hatred that would define their time in Pine Ridge. A group of miners had gathered outside her shelter, led by Hawkins and armed with clubs and rocks. They gave her 1 hour to pack her belongings and leave the camp forever. If she refused, they promised to burn her shelter and drive her into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back. Li Wei looked at May, still weak from fever, and realized they had nowhere to go. The nearest town was 3 days away through mountain terrain that would kill them in the approaching winter. She made a desperate decision that would set the course for everything that followed. Instead of begging or trying to negotiate, Li Wei stood up straight, looked Hawkins in the eye, and told him in her broken English that she would not leave. The land belonged to her dead husband, and therefore to her and her daughter. She would work harder than any man in the camp, cause no trouble, and ask for nothing except the right to survive. If they wanted her gone, they would have to kill her because she had nowhere else to go. The miners were stunned by her defiance. Most Chinese immigrants they had encountered had been submissive and quick to retreat in the face of threats. Hawkins raised his club as if to strike her, and Li Wei closed her eyes, preparing for the blow. But it never came. Instead, a new voice cut through the morning air, calm, but carrying an unmistakable note of authority. When Li Wei opened her eyes, she saw a tall, weathered man standing at the edge of the group, his hand resting casually on the handle of a large knife at his belt. The man was clearly not one of the miners. His clothes were made of buckskin and fur, and his long hair and beard marked him as one of the mountain men who lived in the wilderness year-round. Most importantly, the miners, including Hawkins, had immediately backed away when he appeared. This was Samuel Morrison, though Li Wei wouldn't learn his name for several more days. At that moment, he was simply a stranger who had appeared when she needed help most desperately. Morrison looked at the scene before him, his gray eyes taking in the frightened woman and child, the angry miners, and the destroyed claim papers scattered in the mud. He didn't speak immediately, but his presence changed everything. The miners began to mutter among themselves, clearly unsure how to proceed. Finally, Morrison addressed Hawkins directly, asking what the problem was. When Hawkins explained about the Chinese woman's refusal to leave, Morrison listened without comment, then walked over to examine the torn pieces of the claim papers. After several minutes, Morrison straightened up and announced his decision. The woman had legal papers, torn or not, and until someone could prove those papers were invalid through proper legal channels, she had as much right to be there as anyone else. More importantly, winter was coming, and driving a woman and child into the wilderness was tantamount to murder. Any man who wanted to pursue that course would have to answer to him personally. The miners grumbled and argued, but none were willing to challenge Morrison directly. Li Wei later learned that he was feared throughout the region, not because he was violent, but because he was completely self-sufficient and answered to no authority except his own conscience. He had lived in the mountains for nearly 20 years, knew every trail and hiding place, and had friends among both the peaceful Indian tribes and the Mexican settlers who had lived in California before it became American territory. Cross Morrison, and you might find yourself lost in a blizzard or discover that your supplies had mysteriously disappeared or face any number of other problems that could make life in the wilderness impossible. As the miners reluctantly dispersed, Morrison approached Li Wei and May. He didn't speak Chinese, and her English was limited, but he managed to communicate that they were safe for the moment. He pointed to a spot near a large boulder where they could build a more secure shelter, close enough to the main camp for protection, but far enough away to avoid daily conflicts. He also indicated that there was work to be done, cooking and cleaning that could earn them food and basic supplies. That first intervention saved their lives, but Li Wei knew it was only the beginning. Morrison had prevented immediate violence, but he couldn't change the fundamental hatred that most of the miners felt for Chinese immigrants. She would have to prove herself every day, work harder than anyone expected, and hope that Morrison's protection would continue. As she watched the mountain man disappear back into the forest, Li Wei whispered a prayer of gratitude and began planning how to build a life in a place where she was surrounded by enemies. The first weeks in Pine Ridge tested Li Wei's resolve in ways she had never imagined. Despite Morrison's protection, the daily hostility from the miners was relentless. They would spit in the dirt when she passed, knock over her washing buckets, and steal food she had carefully prepared for paying customers. Some nights, she would wait to find rocks thrown at their shelter or crude messages carved into nearby trees threatening violence if she didn't leave. But Li Wei had learned patience and persistence in the hardest school possible. Growing up during famines in China had taught her that survival meant enduring each day without thought of tomorrow, finding strength in small victories, and never allowing despair to overcome hope. She began each morning by collecting water from the creek, ignoring the hostile stares and whispered threats. She cooked simple but nourishing meals over an open fire, gradually attracting customers who cared more about hot food than their prejudices. Her first real breakthrough came with a miner named Patrick O'Sullivan, an Irishman who had faced his own share of discrimination in America. Patrick had been injured in a mine collapse and was recovering in his tent, unable to cook for himself or maintain basic hygiene. The other miners largely ignored his plight, following the harsh frontier code that expected every man to fend for himself or perish. But Li Wei saw an opportunity to prove her worth through action rather than words. Without being asked, she began bringing Patrick hot soup and rice, carefully prepared with herbs she had foraged from the mountainside. She cleaned his infected wound with boiled water and cloth torn from her own limited clothing, and helped him maintain his tent while his broken ribs healed. Patrick initially resisted her help, uncomfortable with accepting charity from someone the entire camp considered inferior. But hunger and pain eventually overcame his pride, and he began to see Li Wei as a person rather than a symbol of foreign intrusion. As Patrick recovered, he became Li Wei's first real advocate in the camp. His loud Irish accent and quick temper made him a natural spokesman, and he began defending Li Wei when other miners complained about her presence. More importantly, he taught her essential English phrases and helped her understand the complex social dynamics of the mining camp. Patrick explained that most of the miners were not inherently evil, but they were frightened, desperate men who had left everything behind to chase dreams of gold that rarely materialized. Taking out their frustrations on someone different was easier than admitting that their own dreams might be failing. Through Patrick, Li Wei learned about the camp's informal economy and power structure. Bill Hawkins maintained control not through official authority, but through his connections to the supply routes and his willingness to use violence when necessary. Most miners owed him money for supplies, tools, or gambling debts, which gave him leverage over their daily lives. Those who crossed him found their credit cut off or their mining claims disputed by mysterious legal challenges. Morrison's protection was powerful, but limited, since he rarely stayed in the camp for more than a few days at a time before disappearing back into the wilderness. Li Wei also discovered that the hostility toward Chinese immigrants had deep roots beyond simple racism. Many of the miners had previously worked in areas where Chinese laborers had accepted lower wages, driving down pay scales for everyone. Others had heard stories, often exaggerated or completely false, about Chinese workers sending gold back to China instead of spending it in American towns. The recent passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act had given official sanction to these resentments, making hatred feel patriotic rather than shameful. Understanding these dynamics helped Li Wei develop a strategy for survival. Instead of competing directly with American businesses, she focused on services that others were unwilling or unable to provide. She became the camp's unofficial nurse, treating injuries and illnesses with a combination of basic medical knowledge and traditional Chinese remedies. Her gentle touch and careful attention to cleanliness often produced better results than the rough frontier medicine practiced by most miners. She also established herself as the most reliable source of hot, nutritious food in the camp. While other cooks focused on quantity over quality, Li Wei carefully prepared each meal, using wild vegetables and herbs to supplement the basic supplies of rice, flour, and preserved meat. Her food became so popular that even miners who publicly disparaged her would quietly pay for meals, especially when they were sick or particularly lonely for home cooking. May, despite her young age, played a crucial role in softening attitudes toward their presence. Children were rare in mining camps, and May's bright smile and curious nature gradually won over even some of the hardest men. She learned English much faster than her mother, serving as an interpreter and bridge between Li Wei and her customers. Several miners began teaching May to read and write, and she would practice by writing letters home for illiterate workers who wanted to contact their families. But their growing acceptance came with new dangers. As Li Wei became more successful, she also became more visible, and not everyone in the camp was pleased with the gradual changes. A group of miners led by Hawkins began to organize more systematic opposition to her presence. They spread rumors that Li Wei was stealing gold from their claims, that she was practicing witchcraft in her medical treatments, and that her presence would attract other Chinese immigrants who would eventually overrun the camp. The situation escalated when a miner named Tom Bradley died after eating a meal Li Wei had prepared. Bradley had been sick for weeks with what was clearly advanced tuberculosis, but Hawkins immediately accused Li Wei of poisoning him. A mob formed quickly, demanding that Li Wei be driven from the camp or face frontier justice. Patrick tried to defend her, pointing out that Bradley had been dying for months and that Li Wei's cooking had actually helped him survive longer than expected. But Logic had no place in the crowd's anger. Li Wei found herself trapped in her shelter with Mei, listening to the growing crowd outside discuss the best way to punish her. Some wanted to simply run her out of camp, but others demanded more severe retribution. Hawkins seemed to be enjoying the power of controlling the mob, letting the tension build while he decided her fate. Li Wei prepared for the worst, holding Mei close and whispering prayers to her ancestors. Just as the crowd reached a fever pitch, Samuel Morrison emerged from the forest like a ghost materializing from the darkness. He had been away for nearly 2 weeks, and Li Wei had begun to fear that his protection was no longer available. But Morrison had been watching the camp from the surrounding hills, and he had seen the mob forming. His arrival immediately changed the atmosphere, as the miners remembered why they had learned to fear and respect the mountain man. Morrison didn't waste time with speeches or negotiations. He simply walked to the center of the crowd and announced that anyone who harmed Li Wei or her daughter would answer to him personally. But this time, he went further, explaining that Li Wei's medical knowledge and cooking skills made her valuable to the entire camp, and that driving her away would make everyone's life harder. He pointed out that she had never stolen anything, never caused trouble, and had actually helped several miners survive injuries and illnesses that might otherwise have killed them. More importantly, Morrison revealed that he had been investigating Bradley's death and had discovered evidence that the man had been suffering from mercury poisoning caused by his own careless handling of mining chemicals. Bradley's symptoms matched mercury toxicity perfectly, and Morrison had found containers of mercury amalgam in Bradley's tent that had been improperly stored and were leaking into his food and water supplies. Li Wei's meal had been the last thing Bradley ate, but it had nothing to do with his death. This revelation deflated the mob's anger, but it also exposed the depth of Hawkins' dishonesty. He had known about Bradley's mercury poisoning, but had chosen to blame Li Wei instead, seeing an opportunity to finally drive her from the camp. The other miners began to realize that they had been manipulated, and their anger slowly shifted from Li Wei to Hawkins. Morrison skillfully exploited this change in mood, suggesting that perhaps the camp needed to reconsider who was really causing problems. The confrontation ended without violence, but it marked a turning point in Li Wei's relationship with the camp. Many miners who had been neutral or mildly hostile began to see her as a victim of Hawkins' manipulation rather than a threat to their community. Her medical skills became even more valued after Morrison's explanation of mercury poisoning, as several other miners realized they had been experiencing similar symptoms. Li Wei found herself treating a steady stream of patients, earning both money and respect. But the incident also deepened the conflict with Hawkins and his closest supporters. They now saw Li Wei not just as an unwelcome foreigner, but as a direct threat to Hawkins' authority in the camp. If a Chinese woman could successfully challenge his decisions and win support from other miners, what did that say about his leadership? The failure of his attempt to drive her away had damaged his reputation, and he began planning more sophisticated forms of revenge. Li Wei understood that she had won a battle, but not the war. Hawkins would not forgive her for making him look foolish, and Morrison could not protect her every moment of every day. She began to prepare for escalating conflicts, carefully saving money and supplies while building relationships with the miners who had proven themselves trustworthy. She also began teaching Mei about the surrounding mountains, showing her escape routes and places where they could hide if violence finally erupted. Winter was approaching, bringing new challenges and dangers. The high mountain location meant that snow could isolate the camp for months, cutting off supply routes and trapping everyone together in close quarters. Li Wei had survived her first few months in Pine Ridge, but she knew that the real test was still ahead. In a confined space of a snowed-in mining camp, surrounded by men who had been pushed to their breaking point by failed dreams and grinding poverty, anything could happen. As the first snowflakes began to fall, Li Wei looked up at the gray sky and whispered another prayer to her ancestors. She had come so far from her village in China, survived so many dangers, and built the beginning of a new life in this harsh place. But she also knew that Hawkins was planning something, waiting for the right moment to strike back. The mountain man Morrison had become her protector, but even he could not control the forces of hatred and desperation that swirled through the camp like the approaching winter storm. The final confrontation was coming, and Li Wei prepared herself for whatever form it might take. The first heavy snowfall came in early December, transforming Pine Ridge from a muddy mining camp into an isolated fortress of white. Within 3 days, the mountain passes became impassable, cutting off all supply routes until spring. The miners who had planned to leave for warmer climates found themselves trapped with inadequate food, insufficient firewood, and the growing realization that they would have to survive together until the snow melted. Li Wei had prepared for this moment more carefully than most. Throughout the autumn, she had gathered and preserved wild plants, stockpiled firewood, and reinforced her shelter against the brutal mountain cold. Her experience with harsh winters in China had taught her to plan for scarcity, and she had convinced several miners to trade gold dust for preserved vegetables and dried meat that would keep them healthy when fresh food became impossible to obtain. But the isolation also increased tensions in the camp. With no escape route and nothing to do except wait for spring, the miners began to brood on their grievances and resentments. Gambling increased, leading to fights over debts and accusations of cheating. The limited alcohol supply became a constant source of conflict, and men who had maintained uneasy truces during the working season now found themselves confronting months of forced proximity. Hawkins used the isolation to his advantage, gradually building support for a final solution to what he called the Chinese problem. He organized secret meetings in his tent, speaking to small groups of miners about the need to establish clear boundaries before spring brought new immigrants and potential competition. He argued that allowing Li Wei to remain had set a dangerous precedent, and that other Chinese would follow if they believed they could establish themselves in American mining territory. His message found receptive audiences among the miners who had been least successful in their gold prospecting. Men who had spent months digging worthless holes and panning empty streams were eager to blame their failures on anyone except themselves. The idea that Chinese immigrants were somehow stealing their rightful prosperity provided a convenient explanation for their disappointments and a focus for their mounting frustration. Li Wei sensed the changing mood, but found herself in an impossible position. Morrison had disappeared into the mountains just before the heavy snow began, following his usual pattern of winter hunting and trapping. Without his visible protection, she was more vulnerable than she had been since her first days in Pine Ridge. Several miners who had previously been friendly became distant and nervous, clearly unwilling to risk association with her if serious trouble developed. The crisis began with May's illness. The 8-year-old had been fighting a persistent cough since the weather turned cold, and by mid-December, she was running a high fever and struggling to breathe. Li Wei tried every remedy she knew, using precious herbs and medicine she had been saving for emergencies. But May's condition continued to worsen, and Li Wei began to fear for her daughter's life. In desperation, she approached Patrick O'Sullivan, begging him to help her reach the nearest town where a doctor might be available. Patrick wanted to help, but the mountain passes were completely blocked by snow, and attempting to travel would be suicide. He suggested that Li Wei ask some of the other miners for help, pointing out that several had experience with frontier medicine and might have ideas for treating May's illness. But when Li Wei went from tent to tent seeking advice or medicine, she was met with cold refusal and hostile stares. Word had spread through the camp that the Chinese girl was dying, and many miners saw this as either divine punishment or a convenient solution to their immigrant problem. Hawkins had been telling anyone who would listen that Chinese diseases were different from American illnesses and that trying to help might spread contamination to the rest of the camp. Li Wei's desperation grew as May's fever spiked higher. The little girl was barely conscious, her breathing shallow and labored. Li Wei had exhausted her own medical knowledge and supplies, and the hostility of the camp meant that no help would be coming from that direction. She began to prepare herself for the possibility that May would die in this remote place, far from their ancestors and surrounded by people who hated them. On the night of December 18th, as Li Wei sat beside her dying daughter, she heard voices outside her shelter. At first, she thought it might be Morrison returning from the wilderness, but the voices were multiple and unfamiliar. As they grew closer, she realized that a group of miners was approaching her shelter with some kind of plan. She clutched May closer and prepared for whatever was about to happen. The group was led by Hawkins and included 6 other miners, all armed with clubs and torches. They had been drinking heavily, building their courage for what they claimed was a necessary action. Hawkins called out to Li Wei, telling her that the camp had decided she and her daughter needed to leave immediately. The sick girl was a threat to everyone's health, and her continued presence was bringing bad luck to the mining operations. They would give her 1 hour to gather her belongings and then escort her to the edge of the camp. Li Wei emerged from her shelter, leaving Mei wrapped in blankets inside. She faced the 7 men and explained in her broken English that her daughter was too sick to travel, that moving her in the freezing cold would kill her within hours. She begged them to wait until Mei recovered, promising that they would leave voluntarily as soon as travel was safe. But Hawkins laughed and said that waiting was no longer an option. The camp had voted, and the decision was final. The confrontation escalated quickly as Li Wei refused to abandon her dying daughter. Hawkins grabbed her arm, trying to drag her toward the shelter to collect Mei, but Li Wei fought back with the desperate strength of a mother protecting her child. She clawed at his face and kicked at his legs, screaming in Chinese and English for help that she knew would not come. The other miners grabbed her arms and legs, overwhelming her resistance through sheer numbers. Just as they were about to enter her shelter and take Mei, the night exploded in gunfire. 3 shots rang out in rapid succession, and 2 of the miners dropped immediately, blood spreading across the snow. The others released Li Wei and spun around, trying to locate the source of the attack. From the darkness beyond their torches, Samuel Morrison stepped into view, a smoking rifle in his hands and 2 pistols at his belt. Morrison's voice was calm, but deadly as he addressed the group. He explained that he had been watching the camp from the hills and had seen everything that transpired. Any man who wanted to continue the current course of action was welcome to try, but they should understand that he had enough ammunition to kill every one of them before they could reach cover. Moreover, he had left detailed notes about the situation with contacts in Sacramento, and if anything happened to Li Wei or her daughter, questions would be asked that Hawkins and his friends would not be able to answer. The 2 wounded miners were still alive, but badly hurt, blood loss, and shock making them incapable of continuing the fight. The others helped them back toward the main camp, leaving Hawkins alone to face Morrison's cold stare. For a moment, it seemed as though Hawkins might challenge the mountain man directly, but his courage failed when Morrison placed his hand on one of his pistols. Hawkins retreated with threats and curses, promising that the matter was not finished. But Morrison's intervention came almost too late for Mei. The excitement and terror of the attack had worsened her condition, and she was now barely breathing. Li Wei was sobbing as she held her daughter, convinced that the stress had pushed Mei beyond recovery. Morrison examined the girl quickly and recognized the symptoms of severe pneumonia complicated by altitude sickness. Without immediate treatment, she would not survive the night. Morrison made a decision that surprised everyone, including Li Wei. He told her that there was a possibility of saving Mei, but it would require a dangerous journey through the mountains to reach a settlement where medical supplies were available. The trip would take 2 days through treacherous terrain, and there was no guarantee that either of them would survive the attempt. But staying in Pine Ridge meant certain death for Mei and probable violence for Li Wei once Morrison left again. Li Wei didn't hesitate. She gathered their few essential belongings while Morrison prepared his pack animals and winter gear. He had been planning to spend the winter in a remote cabin, but this emergency changed everything. As they prepared to leave, Patrick O'Sullivan approached with a small bundle of food and warm clothing, apologizing for his inability to help more directly. He also warned them that Hawkins was already organizing a pursuit party, claiming that Morrison had committed murder and needed to be brought to justice. The journey began in the pre-dawn darkness, with Morrison carrying Mei wrapped in furs while Li Wei struggled to keep up through the deep snow. The mountain man knew hidden trails that avoided the main passes, but these routes were even more dangerous, winding along cliff faces and through areas where avalanches were constant threats. The temperature was well below zero, and the wind cut through their clothing like knives. For Li Wei, the journey became a nightmare of exhaustion and terror. She had never experienced cold this extreme, and her feet quickly became numb despite the heavy boots Morrison had given her. Several times, she fell behind, and Morrison had to wait for her to catch up, precious time lost while Mei's condition continued to deteriorate. But Morrison never complained or suggested abandoning the attempt. his weathered face set in grim determination as he navigated the treacherous mountain paths. They were pursued for the first day by Hawkins and for other miners, but the pursuit party was not prepared for winter mountain travel. After one of their horses broke through ice and nearly drowned in a hidden creek, they turned back, leaving Morrison and Li Wei to continue their desperate race against time. The mountain man's knowledge of the terrain and his winter survival skills kept them alive, but it was clear that May was slipping away with each passing hour. On the second night, they reached Morrison's emergency shelter, a small cabin hidden in a grove of pine trees. Morrison had cached medical supplies there, including laudanum for pain and whiskey for sterilization. He also had materials for building up the fire and creating the warm, humid environment that May needed to break her fever. Working together, they managed to get some liquid medicine into the unconscious girl and wrapped her in heated blankets near the roaring fire. Li Wei spent that night in prayer, alternating between Chinese invocations to her ancestors and desperate pleas to any American gods who might be listening. Morrison sat silently beside the fire, cleaning his weapons and watching the surrounding forest for signs of pursuit or wildlife. Neither of them slept, knowing that this night would determine whether their desperate journey had any chance of success. As dawn broke over the snow-covered mountains, May's fever finally broke. Her breathing became deeper and more regular, and she opened her eyes for the first time in days. Li Wei wept with relief as her daughter whispered for water and asked where they were. Morrison smiled for the first time since the crisis began, recognizing the signs of recovery that meant their journey had not been in vain. But they were still far from safety. Hawkins would not give up easily, and Pine Ridge was no longer safe for them. Morrison explained that they had only one option: to continue deeper into the mountains to a settlement called Bear Creek, where Morrison had friends who would shelter them until spring. It would mean leaving behind everything they had built in Pine Ridge, but it would also mean survival and the possibility of a new beginning. Bear Creek settlement emerged from the morning mist like something from a dream. Unlike the harsh mining camp they had fled, this community was built around a natural hot spring that kept the valley warm even in the depths of winter. Native American families lived alongside Mexican settlers, trappers, and a few American pioneers who had chosen cooperation over conflict. Morrison's arrival with Li Wei and May caused curiosity rather than hostility, and the settlement's leader, an elderly Miwok chief named Joseph Running Bear, welcomed them with quiet dignity. Li Wei had never experienced such acceptance in America. The diverse population of Bear Creek had learned to judge people by their actions rather than their appearance, and Li Wei's obvious devotion to her daughter and her respectful manner quickly earned her a place in the community. A Mexican woman named Maria Gonzalez took them into her home, offering space near a fireplace where May could continue recovering from her illness. Maria's own story paralleled Li Wei's in many ways. Her family had been living in California for 3 generations when the gold rush brought American settlers who claimed Mexican land grants were invalid. Rather than fight hopeless legal battles, Maria had moved to Bear Creek with her children, finding safety in a community that valued cooperation over conquest. She taught Li Wei about local plants and hunting techniques while learning Chinese cooking methods that helped stretch their winter food supplies. As May's health improved, Li Wei began to understand Morrison's reasons for bringing them to this remote valley. Bear Creek operated outside the normal American legal system, governed by consensus among the various cultural groups rather than by federal or state authority. Chinese immigrants were not automatically unwelcome here, and a woman traveling alone was not seen as an inherent threat to social order. For the first time since leaving China, Li Wei felt like she might be able to build a permanent home. Morrison spent several weeks in Bear Creek, longer than his usual stays anywhere. He was clearly troubled by the situation they had left behind in Pine Ridge, knowing that Hawkins would not simply accept defeat. The mountain man had contacts throughout the region, and reports filtering in suggested that Hawkins was spreading stories about Morrison's attack on the miners, claiming that the mountain man had been corrupted by Chinese influence and could no longer be trusted to support American interests. These stories were more dangerous than simple camp gossip because they threatened Morrison's ability to operate throughout his territory. His survival depended on maintaining relationships with dozens of communities, trading posts, and individual settlers scattered across hundreds of square miles of wilderness. If his reputation was damaged, he would find himself isolated and unable to obtain the supplies and information he needed to survive in the mountains. Li Wei recognized the sacrifice Morrison was making for her family's safety. By protecting them, he had made enemies who would use his actions against him for years to come. She tried to express her gratitude, but Morrison was uncomfortable with emotional displays and preferred to focus on practical matters. He began teaching Li Wei and Mei essential wilderness skills, showing them how to read weather patterns, find safe water sources, and identify edible plants that could sustain them if they were ever forced to flee again. But their peaceful winter in Bear Creek was interrupted by troubling news from the outside world. Chinese immigrants throughout California were facing increasing violence as economic conditions worsened and political leaders sought scapegoats for the region's problems. The Chinese Exclusion Act was being enforced more strictly, with raids on Chinatowns and mass deportations of anyone who couldn't prove legal residence. Several mining camps had expelled their Chinese populations entirely, burning buildings and driving families into the wilderness without supplies or protection. More specifically, word reached Bear Creek that Hawkins had not been idle during the winter months. He had traveled to Sacramento and San Francisco, meeting with anti-Chinese organizations and spreading his version of events in Pine Ridge. According to his account, Morrison had committed unprovoked murder to protect Chinese criminals who were stealing American gold and spreading disease among honest miners. He was calling for federal intervention to capture Morrison and return Li Wei and Mei to face justice for their alleged crimes. Morrison realized that their safety in Bear Creek was temporary at best. Federal marshals would eventually investigate Hawkins' claims, and even the most tolerant communities would be forced to cooperate with official law enforcement. More importantly, Morrison's continued presence in Bear Creek was putting the entire settlement at risk. If authorities came looking for him, they would find a multicultural community that violated several federal policies regarding Indian reservations and Mexican land rights. As spring approached and the mountain passes began to clear, Morrison made a difficult decision. He would leave Bear Creek and draw any pursuit away from Li Wei and Mei, but they could not remain in the settlement permanently either. The summer would bring increased traffic through the mountains, including officials who might recognize them from Hawkins' descriptions. They needed a more permanent solution that would place them beyond the reach of their enemies. Morrison proposed a bold plan that would require careful timing and considerable risk. He had contacts among the Chinese communities in San Francisco who operated outside official channels, helping immigrants avoid deportation and find work in remote areas where federal authority was limited. If Li Wei and Mei could reach San Francisco safely, these networks could help them establish new identities and relocate to areas where Hawkins' influence could not reach them. But traveling to San Francisco meant crossing hundreds of miles of territory where they could be recognized and captured. Morrison suggested that they join a wagon train heading west, disguising themselves as servants to a Mexican family who would provide cover for their journey. Maria Gonzalez had relatives in Los Angeles who traded regularly with San Francisco merchants, and she offered to write letters of introduction that would help them find work and shelter along the way. Li Wei was torn by the decision. Bear Creek had become the closest thing to home she had experienced in America, and leaving meant abandoning the first real friendships she had made since Chen's death. But she also understood that staying would eventually bring danger to the people who had protected her. Mei's recovery was complete, and she was old enough to handle the rigors of travel. Most importantly, remaining in hiding forever was no way to build the life Li Wei had dreamed of when she left China. The departure from Bear Creek was emotional and fraught with uncertainty. Joseph Running Bear performed a ceremony asking the mountain spirits to protect their journey, while Maria packed supplies and medicines that would sustain them on the road. Morrison gave Li Wei a letter written in English, explaining their situation to his contacts in San Francisco and requesting assistance in finding safe refuge. He also gave her a small bag of gold dust, enough to purchase necessities and pay for help when they reached the city. But before they could begin their journey to California's coast, Hawkins made his final move against them. He had spent the winter building a case with federal authorities, convincing them that Morrison represented a serious threat to law and order in the mining regions. A warrant had been issued for Morrison's arrest on charges of murder and conspiracy, and a company of federal marshals was already en route to Bear Creek with orders to capture the mountain man and anyone assisting him. The warning came from Patrick O'Sullivan, who had left Pine Ridge as soon as spring travel became possible. He had ridden hard to reach Bear Creek ahead of the marshals, risking his own safety to warn Morrison and Lee Wei about the approaching danger. Patrick's information was detailed and terrifying, indicating that Hawkins had convinced authorities that Morrison was the leader of a criminal organization that included Chinese smugglers and Indian raiders. Morrison's response was swift and decisive. He gathered Lee Wei and May immediately, abandoning plans for a careful journey to San Francisco in favor of an immediate escape into the deepest wilderness. His knowledge of secret trails and hidden caches would keep them ahead of any pursuit, but they would have to travel light and fast, carrying only essential supplies and depending on Morrison's survival skills to keep them alive. The escape from Bear Creek began at dawn, with Morrison leading Lee Wei and May along mountain paths that few white men had ever seen. They were pursued within hours by a company of 12 federal marshals, led by a captain who had been convinced that capturing Morrison would be a significant victory against lawlessness in the territories. The marshals had local guides and were well equipped for mountain travel, making them a more serious threat than anything Morrison had faced before. For 3 days, they played a deadly game of cat and mouse through the Sierra Nevada wilderness. Morrison used every trick he had learned in 20 years of mountain living, creating false trails, hiding their tracks in rocky stream beds, and leading the pursuit through areas where landslides and avalanches made travel extremely dangerous. But the marshals were persistent and skilled, gradually closing the distance despite Morrison's best efforts. On the 4th day, Morrison made a decision that demonstrated the full measure of his courage and loyalty. Rather than continue running with Lee Wei and May, which would eventually result in all of them being captured, he would create a diversion that would draw the marshals away from them while giving them a chance to escape. He knew a series of caves near the headwaters of the American River where Lee Wei and May could hide safely for several days while he led the pursuit in a different direction. Lee Wei protested desperately, understanding that Morrison's plan was essentially a suicide mission. The marshals were too numerous and well-armed for him to evade indefinitely, and his capture would leave her and May alone in the wilderness without the skills needed for long-term survival. But Morrison's mind was made up. He had given his word to protect them, and he would honor that promise regardless of the personal cost. The separation took place in a narrow canyon where 3 mountain streams converged. Morrison showed Lee Wei the entrance to the cave system and explained how to find water and edible plants in the immediate area. He left them most of his remaining supplies and ammunition, keeping only what he needed for the desperate chase ahead. As he prepared to leave, May clung to him, the mountain man having become the closest thing to a father she had known since Chen's death. Morrison's final words to Lee Wei were a promise that he would find a way to survive and return for them, but his eyes told a different story. He was a man saying goodbye to people he had grown to love, accepting that this sacrifice was necessary for their survival, even if it meant his own destruction. As he disappeared into the forest, Lee Wei heard the sound of gunshots echoing from the canyon below, indicating that the marshals had found his trail and the final chase had begun. Alone with May in the hidden cave system, Lee Wei faced the most difficult period of her entire journey. She had food and water for perhaps a week, after which she would have to attempt the journey to San Francisco without Morrison's guidance or protection. The sounds of pursuit continued for 2 more days before fading into the distance, leaving her to wonder whether Morrison had escaped or been captured. All she could do was wait, pray to her ancestors for guidance, and prepare May for whatever challenges lay ahead. 7 days passed in the cave before Lee Wei made the decision that would define the rest of her life in America. The sound of gunfire had ended 3 days earlier, and no sign of Morrison had appeared. She could wait no longer without risking starvation for herself and May. Using the crude map Morrison had drawn in the dirt before leaving, she began the treacherous journey toward the Sacramento Valley, hoping to find help before their limited supplies ran out completely. The descent from the high mountains proved even more dangerous than Lee Wei had feared. Without Morrison's expert guidance, she frequently took wrong turns, leading them down box canyons or onto unstable slopes where rocks tumbled away beneath their feet. May, though recovered from her illness, was still weak from their ordeal, and Lee Wei found herself carrying her daughter for hours at a time through terrain that challenged even experienced mountaineers. On their fourth day of travel, they encountered a group of Mexican traders heading north with pack animals loaded with supplies. Li Wei approached them cautiously, using the few Spanish words Maria Gonzalez had taught her, and showing them the letter of introduction Morrison had written. The traders' leader, an elderly man named Carlos Mendoza, listened to their story with growing amazement and compassion. He agreed to escort them to Sacramento, where they could find transportation to San Francisco and safety. But the journey with the Mexican traders brought disturbing news about Morrison's fate. According to information Mendoza had gathered from other travelers, the mountain man had been wounded in a gun battle with federal marshals, but had managed to escape into the deepest wilderness. However, his injuries were severe, and most people believed he would not survive the winter alone in the mountains. The marshals had abandoned their pursuit after losing 2 men to avalanches and hostile territory, declaring Morrison dead and closing their investigation. Li Wei's grief at this news was overwhelming, but she forced herself to focus on survival and the future. Morrison had sacrificed everything to give her and May a chance at freedom, and she would honor that sacrifice by building the life he had died to protect. When they reached Sacramento, she used Morrison's letter of introduction to contact his allies in the Chinese community, finding help and guidance for the final leg of their journey to San Francisco. The city that greeted Li Wei in the summer of 1883 was vastly different from the hostile frontier camps she had known. San Francisco's Chinatown, despite facing constant pressure from anti-Chinese legislation, had become a thriving community where Chinese immigrants could find work, education, and protection from the worst excesses of discrimination. Morrison's contacts helped Li Wei establish a new identity as a widow named Chun Li, the survivor of a mining accident who had come to the city seeking work to support her daughter. Li Wei found employment in a garment factory owned by a Chinese businessman who asked no questions about her past. The work was difficult and the pay was low, but it provided a steady income and the safety of anonymity. May was enrolled in a school run by Christian missionaries, where she learned to read and write English with remarkable speed. For the first time since leaving China, Li Wei began to believe that they might have a genuine future in America. But their new life was shadowed by the continuing persecution of Chinese immigrants throughout California. The Chinese Exclusion Act was being enforced with increasing brutality, and even established communities like San Francisco's Chinatown faced constant threats of violence and deportation. Li Wei lived in fear that someone would recognize her from Hawkins' descriptions or that federal authorities would somehow track her to the city. Her fears proved justified 18 months after their arrival in San Francisco. A man who had been in Pine Ridge during their time there recognized Li Wei working in the garment factory and reported her presence to local authorities. Within days, federal marshals arrived at her workplace with arrest warrants charging her with complicity in Morrison's alleged crimes. Li Wei barely escaped through a back window, grabbing May from school and fleeing to a safe house maintained by Chinese community leaders. The network that had protected Li Wei and thousands of other Chinese immigrants proved its worth during this crisis. Within hours, they had arranged passage on a ship bound for Vancouver, where Canadian immigration laws offered more protection for Chinese refugees. Li Wei found herself once again leaving behind everything she had built, but this time she was not alone. May was now fluent in English and capable of serving as translator and advocate, while the Chinese Community Support Network provided resources and connections that made their escape possible. The ship journey to Vancouver was Li Wei's second ocean crossing, but this time she traveled as an experienced survivor rather than a frightened refugee. She used the voyage to plan their next steps, determining that they would head inland to a small farming community where Chinese immigrants had established successful agricultural operations. Her experiences in the mountains had taught her valuable skills in food preservation and herbal medicine that would be useful in a farming community. British Columbia's Chinese community welcomed Li Wei and May warmly, recognizing them as refugees from American persecution rather than simple immigrants seeking economic opportunities. They found work on a vegetable farm outside Vancouver, where Li Wei's agricultural knowledge from her childhood in China proved invaluable. May continued her education in the local school, becoming one of the first Chinese students to receive a formal Canadian education. For 5 years, they built a peaceful and productive life in their Canadian refuge. Li Wei became known throughout the region for her skills as a healer, combining traditional Chinese medicine with techniques she had learned from Morrison and the diverse community in Bear Creek. May grew into a confident young woman who moved easily between Chinese and Canadian cultures, serving as a bridge between her mother and their new community. But Li Wei never forgot the debt she owed to Samuel Morrison or stopped hoping for news of his survival. She maintained correspondence with contacts throughout the American West, always asking for information about the mountain man who had saved their lives. For years, the answers were always the same. No one had seen Morrison alive since the gun battle with federal marshals, and most assumed he had died from his wounds in the wilderness. Then, in the spring of 1890, an unexpected letter arrived that changed everything Li Wei thought she knew about Morrison's fate. The letter was written in shaky handwriting by a man identifying himself as Samuel Morrison, explaining that he had indeed been wounded in the gun battle, but had survived by hiding in remote mountain caves until his injuries healed. He had spent the intervening years living as a hermit in the deepest wilderness, avoiding all contact with civilization to prevent renewed pursuit by federal authorities. Morrison's letter revealed that he had finally learned of Li Wei's location through the same network of mountain traders and trappers that had always been his source of information. He was now living peacefully in a small cabin in the Canadian Rockies, finally safe from American law enforcement, but deeply lonely after years of complete isolation. He asked if it would be possible for Li Wei and May to visit him, explaining that thoughts of their safety had sustained him through the darkest periods of his exile. Li Wei's reunion with Morrison, after nearly 7 years of separation, was deeply emotional for both of them. The mountain man had aged considerably during his years of isolation, and his wounded leg had never healed properly, leaving him with a permanent limp. But his spirit remained strong, and his joy at seeing Li Wei and May safe and thriving was evident in his tears and laughter. May, now 16 years old, was amazed to meet the legendary figure who had saved her life as a child. Morrison marveled at her transformation from a sick little girl into an articulate young woman who could speak 3 languages and had received more formal education than most frontier children ever dreamed of. He told her stories of her courage during their escape from Pine Ridge, helping her understand how much strength she had shown even as a child. The 3 of them spent 2 weeks together in Morrison's mountain cabin, sharing stories and memories while planning for the future. Morrison had saved a considerable amount of gold during his years as a trapper and mountain man, and he insisted on giving most of it to Li Wei and May to secure their future in Canada. He also gave May a collection of journals he had kept during his years in the wilderness, documenting his observations of wildlife, weather patterns, and Native American customs that would become valuable historical records. But perhaps most importantly, Morrison's survival allowed Li Wei to finally understand the full meaning of the sacrifice he had made for their freedom. He explained that the decision to lead the marshals away from their hiding place had been the easiest choice of his life, because protecting them had given his solitary existence a purpose and meaning it had previously lacked. Their friendship had changed him from a man who lived only for himself into someone who understood the value of loyalty and love. Li Wei returned to her home in British Columbia with a sense of completion that had been missing since leaving China. She had found Morrison alive and, well, proving that their escape had not cost him his life as she had feared. May had met the man who had saved them and could now understand the full story of their journey to freedom. Most importantly, Li Wei had finally achieved the security and acceptance she had sought when she first left China. In the years that followed, Li Wei became a respected member of her Canadian community, serving as a midwife and healer while helping other Chinese immigrants adjust to their new lives. May married a Canadian farmer of Scottish descent, becoming one of the first successful Chinese-Canadian intermarriages in their region. She had 3 children who grew up speaking Chinese, English, and French, representing the multicultural future that Canada was beginning to embrace. Morrison visited them twice more before his death in 1895, each time marveling at the family and community Li Wei had built through her courage and determination. He died peacefully in his mountain cabin, leaving behind a letter requesting that his story be remembered as proof that friendship could transcend all barriers of race, nationality, and culture. Li Wei lived until 1923, long enough to see her grandchildren grown and to witness the gradual improvement in treatment of Chinese immigrants throughout North America. She never returned to China, but she maintained correspondence with relatives who survived the famines and wars that continued to devastate her homeland. Her journals, written in both Chinese and English, became important historical documents that helped later generations understand the experiences of Chinese immigrants during one of the most difficult periods in North American history. The small house where Li Wei spent her final years became a gathering place for Chinese families throughout the region, where children learned traditional stories and customs while also preparing for their futures as Canadians. Above the fireplace hung a photograph of Samuel Morrison taken during one of his visits, a reminder of the mountain man who had risked everything to protect a Chinese woman and her daughter when no one else would help them. Li Wei's story became a legend in both Chinese and Canadian communities, passed down through generations as proof that courage, determination, and unexpected friendship could overcome even the worst prejudice and hatred. Her journey from a desperate refugee to a respected community leader demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of finding home in the most unlikely places. In her final journal entry, written shortly before her death, Li Wei reflected on the long journey that had brought her from a small village in China to a peaceful farm in Canada. She wrote that every hardship had been worthwhile because it led to the freedom and opportunities her grandchildren would inherit. Most importantly, her story proved that even in the darkest moments, when hatred seemed overwhelming and hope appeared lost, there were still people like Samuel Morrison who would stand up for what was right, regardless of the cost.